Now I'd like to turn our attention to whether or not cannabis can increase sexual activity, sexual desire, and or sexual function. So we're going to be talking about libido, about sexual desire, and about effects of cannabis on hormones. And while this might sound like a discussion that's purely oriented towards recreational use of cannabis, that is, people using cannabis to heighten or increase their sense of arousal for sexual activity, it actually ventures into the clinical realm too, meaning there have been excellent peer-reviewed studies that I'll describe to you in a moment, exploring the use of cannabis, or THC more specifically, for something called hypoactive sexual desire disorder, which refers to a persistent or recurrent deficiency or absence of sexual fantasies and thoughts and or desire for or receptivity to sexual activity. This is a disorder that is fairly common, anywhere from 6 to 9% of people, both males and females. It used to be considered higher prevalence in females than in males, but now those numbers seem to be evening out. So basically, there are anywhere from 6 to 9% of people out there who have very diminished sexual desire. And so a number of those people are interested in figuring out ways to increase their amount of sexual desire. And of course, there are people in the general population who may not have hypoactive sexual desire disorder who are interested in using cannabis recreationally in order to increase their desire for or their experience of sexual activity. Now, first, we have to acknowledge that sexual desire and activity is a complex set of processes, meaning it's not just one event, sex, the verb. It involves arousal, it involves sex, the verb, and it involves a whole set of mindsets and emotional states that vary tremendously between individuals. But once again, we can distill out a few basic principles, and I should emphasize these are by no means the only chemicals and neural circuits involved in the sexual arc, as we'll call it, desire, the act of sex, etc. But they are central to it. They are vital to it. They would be considered what I would call necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, so there'll be other chemicals involved too. But the main chemicals and neural circuits are those involved in dopamine. So the so-called mesolimbic reward pathway, in particular, a brain structure called nucleus accumbens, which we'll talk about more in a moment, is vital to all motivated behaviors and to the seeking out of all particular types of pleasurable experiences, and sex is no exception. So when we hear that the nucleus accumbens is activated, that almost always means that dopamine has been released in that area and other areas of the brain and body, and we can consider dopamine central to the desire for, pursuit of, and act of sex. In addition to that, there are molecules like oxytocin, which are involved in pair bonding, and they're going to be neural circuits specific to the oxytocin circuitry. But in terms of sexual arousal and sexual behavior, it's really the dopamine pathway and this nucleus accumbens which are especially vital. That allows us to address the question, does cannabis increase, decrease, or have no effect on sexual desire and or the ability to have sex? And therein we will find some very interesting answers, because once again, it will point to the fact that the effects of cannabis on different individuals can be highly divergent, meaning in one set of individuals, cannabis will make them far less anxious. And in another set of individuals, the same strain of cannabis at the same dosage will make them extremely anxious. The same can be said also of sexual activity. And this was beautifully illustrated in the context of sexual desire in the journal Psychopharmacology in a paper published in 2017. The title of this paper is Individual Prolactin Reactivity Modulates Response of Nucleus Accumbens to Erotic Stimuli During Acute Cannabis Intoxication, an fMRI pilot study. So I'll give a little bit of definition to some of the terms in the title that will make it easier for you to understand the paper. But then I'll just march through the results because they are very straightforward and easy to understand and very interesting. fMRI is just functional magnetic resonance imaging. So basically, subjects in this experiment came into the laboratory. They were either people who had not used cannabis before or who had used cannabis before. They were placed into a brain scanner, one of these fMRI devices. It looks like a tube that people are sort of backed up into, and then they can view images in there, and their brain can be imaged without having to remove any skull or drill into the skull, no neurosurgery. The participants in this study were grouped according to whether or not they had experienced any aphrodisiac effects during the intoxication with cannabis. So that would be the first group, Group A. They literally called it Group A for aphrodisiac. And then the second group, and this is the only thing I don't like about this study, is rather than call it Group B, they called them Group Non-A, which is just gets a little confusing. So I'll try and simplify all this. There are two groups, and one group experiences sexual arousal when under the influence of cannabis, THC specifically. The other group does not. And it turns out this is a very commonly observed divergence of effects of cannabis. Some people experience a lot of sexual arousal from cannabis and THC in particular, and some people do not. In fact, they experience suppression of sexual desire. And it's always been a little bit mysterious as to why that is. Well, in this study, they showed people in both groups erotic images, and they measured sexual arousal through a number of different measures. We won't go into all that. It was largely subjective. There have been other studies where they've actually measured things like erections in males and vaginal lubrication in females, the sort of so-called autonomic responses that people can't lie about, so to speak, and that tap into other aspects of the so-called sexual arousal process. In this study, they also took blood samples to look at the concentration of things like cannabinoids. So this is a really nice study in that they actually measured how much THC was in the bloodstream in different individuals who reacted to these erotic stimuli in different ways. And they measured hormones, namely cortisol, which is a stress hormone, which tends to negatively correlate with sexual arousal, and prolactin. And the interesting takeaway from the study was that for people, and it didn't matter if it was males or females because they looked at both, for people that experienced elevated prolactin levels under cannabis intoxication, that's how they referred to it. People take cannabis, they measured prolactin. Some people had elevated prolactin, some people did not. Okay. For the people that had elevated levels of prolactin, they did not observe activation of brain areas associated with sexual arousal. In this case, the right nucleus accumbens. So you have two nucleus accumbens, I guess they would be called, one on each side of the brain. And the activation of that brain area is strongly associated with dopamine and with arousal, and sexual arousal in particular in this study. And if people had elevated prolactin, they did not experience activation of nucleus accumbens, and they did not report feeling sexually aroused to those pictures, at least not to the same degree as the other group. So some people's prolactin levels go up when they ingest cannabis, and those people do not achieve elevated levels of sexual arousal when under the influence of cannabis, even if they're looking at erotic stimuli. That makes sense because prolactin is mutually inhibitory, as we would say. It's kind of in a push-pull with dopamine. When dopamine levels are high, prolactin levels tend to be low. And when prolactin levels are high, dopamine levels tend to be low. The other group, so-called Group A, that experienced elevated levels of sexual arousal when under the influence of cannabis and viewing erotic stimuli, that group did not show elevated levels of prolactin in response to cannabis. So this, I believe, resolves a longstanding controversy in the field, which is, does cannabis increase sexual arousal? Well, it depends. If you fall into the category of person who has elevated levels of prolactin in response to cannabis, then no, actually cannabis will suppress your sexual response and desire. If, however, you are in the category of person that does not have elevated levels of prolactin in response to cannabis, well, then erotic stimuli can potentially, and in fact do, increase sexual arousal in the majority of individuals. Now, many of you are probably hearing this and wondering whether or not you fall into one category of individual or another. And the key thing here to understand is that levels of prolactin heading into the study did not predict whether or not people would respond to cannabis with elevated or non-elevated or even reduced levels of sexual arousal. It was whether or not people's prolactin levels went up or did not go up that predicted whether or not their levels of arousal would go up or not. So if you are somebody who, yes, does experience elevated levels of sexual arousal and function when under the influence of cannabis, well, that's very likely that cannabis does not increase your prolactin levels, at least not to a significant degree while you're taking it. And if you are somebody who does not experience increases in sexual arousal or function, or even diminished sexual arousal and function when under the influence of cannabis, it's very likely the cannabis is increasing your levels of prolactin. Unfortunately, there's no way to know or predict based on some other measure. I think the outcome measure, that is increased or not increased or even reduced sexual arousal, is really the litmus test by which one can figure that out. While we are on the topic of the effects of cannabis on sexual function and hormones like prolactin, it's probably worth mentioning that cannabis has been studied extensively for its impact on other hormones. And we can summarize those literature in the following way. And here I'm referring to studies only on adults. We will talk about the developing brain and body in a little bit. But it is very clear that smoking cannabis increases prolactin levels. Very, very clear. Now, you might say, didn't you just describe a study about a set of individuals whose prolactin didn't increase, and as a consequence, their level of sexual desire went up? Yes, there are a subset of individuals for which that's true. But people who smoke cannabis do experience increases in prolactin, and that's especially pronounced in people that smoke cannabis more than twice a week. So this is important. Prolactin, as I referred to earlier, is reciprocal or mutually inhibitory with dopamine. One way to think about this is in the context of the normal sexual arousal arc, whereby dopamine is increased when people are sexually aroused, but then after orgasm, both in males and females, prolactin levels skyrocket. This is actually what creates the so-called refractory period for males, during which they cannot achieve erection again for some period of time. That relates directly to how long the prolactin increase lasts. Okay. Prolactin is also increased in new parents of all species, including humans, which at least partially explains some of the reported or typical reductions in sexual desire and activity in new parents. Now, there are other reasons for that too, sleep deprivation, but nature is smart and has arranged a set of hormones and circuits in the brain and body such that when tending to a newborn is the most important thing, it reduces the importance of producing more children and sexual activity in those moments and days and weeks, sometimes longer. So when prolactin levels are up, dopamine levels are down. Smoking marijuana more than twice a week significantly increases prolactin. There are fewer studies exploring whether or not edible marijuana has the same effect, although the preliminary evidence suggests that it does not. I get into this in a lot more detail in a future episode, all about hormones, with Dr. Kyle Gillette, who's been on this podcast before, but he verified that, and my read of the literature is that the edible forms of marijuana, cannabis, probably, again, let's put an asterisk next to this, but it appears do not have as much of a prolactin elevating effect, and therefore not as much of a dopamine suppressive effect, and therefore not as much of a testosterone suppressing effect. And that gets to the issue of testosterone. Does cannabis, marijuana, suppress testosterone? And this is a very controversial literature, and here's why. Some studies say, yes, it suppresses testosterone in males and females. And keep in mind that testosterone in females is vital for libido and cognitive function, cellular repair, etc. So it's not just important in males, of course. However, other studies say that cannabis does not decrease testosterone. And it seems to depend on whether or not the cannabis is brought into the system by way of smoking or edible. And it seems to depend on whether or not the cannabis is used chronically by an individual or acutely. And here I just want to zoom out and say that studies on cannabis or drugs of any kind in humans are really complicated. If you think about it, someone has to come into the laboratory, and let's say you want to study chronic cannabis use. Well, you can't keep them in the laboratory all the time. So you have to rely on their self-report of how often they use cannabis and in what form. And you can't really control from one individual to the next of how much cannabis and THC they're bringing into their system. One person might smoke cannabis out of a bong and take big, deep, lungs full bong inhalations or such. Other people might smoke joints. Other people might use edibles. It becomes very complicated to know what people have done and that they're reporting it accurately. And no joke here, especially if marijuana is impacting the short-term memory systems. They might not actually remember. They might not be tracking it that well. Contrast that with studies of the acute use of cannabis and THC, where people who are not regular users come into the laboratory and now suddenly, with institutional guidelines and safety protocols, are under the influence of THC and cannabis. Well, now you're dealing with a person who may not have experience with the elevated heart rate and blood pressure that's characteristic of cannabis, because it is a stimulant, at least when initially brought into the system, even if it might eventually lead to relaxation. So now you've got someone who's anxious or somebody who's not anxious, who's deeply relaxed, and you're trying to study these effects. So it's a moving target of sorts. And it's very complicated to study marijuana and cannabis and its various derivatives in this way. Now you can probably appreciate better as to why there's so little nuanced data about sativa versus indica versus different ratios of CBD and THC. It's really difficult to do these studies in the first place. That said, the general rules are smoking marijuana increases prolactin in men and women, which will reduce dopamine and testosterone. Smoking marijuana chronically, meaning more than twice a week, does appear to reduce testosterone significantly and elevate so-called aromatase enzymes, which are the enzymes that convert testosterone into estrogen. This might partially explain the effect that occurs in about 35% of males, which is gynecomastia, which is a development of breast tissue in males, in particular young males who have elevated levels of testosterone or who are taking exogenous testosterone for testosterone replacement therapy, or if they're taking high doses anabolic steroids, or in females, the increase in breast size, which is due to additional estrogen from testosterone converted to estrogen. So it does appear that marijuana and cannabis increase estrogen, reduce testosterone, increase prolactin, especially in chronic users. Now, I'm sure that some people out there will say, well, their testosterone levels are exceedingly high, or they are fine, meaning the constellation of symptoms associated with low testosterone and elevated estrogen are not present in them. That probably means one of two things, or both. They either had elevated levels of testosterone to begin with, so their ceiling was higher, so bringing it down didn't have that much of effect, or that they have very low levels of aromatase in their system. There is some anecdotal evidence that smoking particular parts of the marijuana plant, in particular the seeds, can increase aromatase and the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. I think in the old days, the lore was the seeds make you sterile, and I think that was related to what I just told you, this increase in conversion of testosterone to estrogen. There's a vast literature on the effects of cannabis on fertility. It does seem to alter sperm motility and sperm health and function when taken chronically more than twice per week, in particular high doses of high potency THC. This is something we will cover in far more detail on a future episode all about fertility. And in females, there's an increase in estrogen as a consequence of smoking marijuana and increasing prolactin and estrogen in parallel. Whether or not that's detrimental isn't clear, although I point out that elevated estrogen and prolactin can be associated, not necessarily, and certainly not causative, but can be associated with elevated levels of or frequency of breast cancer detection. So cannabis and its effects on hormones are not without consequence. There are effects of cannabis on cortisol. In some individuals, it greatly increases cortisol due to the anxiety and paranoia it can create. And in other individuals, it reduces cortisol. Again, we have these divergent effects. But I want to be very clear. The effects on prolactin, meaning elevated prolactin, the effects on testosterone, meaning at least most studies point to reduced levels of testosterone and increased estrogen. That seems to be true for most all individuals that chronically use cannabis, whereas the effects on cortisol tend to be divergent. Cannabis increases cortisol in some individuals and decreases cortisol in others. In general, increases in cortisol that are ongoing are not healthy for us, and so on. And then, of course, there are other effects on hormones, and I'll just briefly summarize those, that THC in particular, not CBD, but THC in particular, is known to be strongly inhibitory for something called gonadotropin-releasing hormone. This is a hormone that's released from the brain, from the hypothalamus, that then feeds onto, or I should say signals to the pituitary gland, which is also near the roof of your mouth. A lot of stuff happening near the roof of your mouth, it turns out, biologically. And reduced levels of gonadotropin-releasing hormone caused by cannabis use, reduced levels of LH, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which reduce levels of testosterone and sperm production in males, and egg health and ovulation and menstrual function in females. Now, I'm sure there are a number of women out there who will say they have perfectly normal menstrual cycles despite using cannabis. I'm certainly not going to dispute that. But if you are somebody who's trying to maximize fertility or regulate or balance hormones, marijuana and cannabis reduces GnRH, that is the gonadotropin released from the hypothalamus, and thereby reduces luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which are released from the pituitary and travel in the bloodstream to support normal ovarian function and health and normal testicular function and health in females and males, respectively.